Hey everybody, welcome back to another map of the day. So the map we're going to be taking a look at today is called Scorched. So this is the way it looks. Players are in the center of the map on this cracked terrain. There's pretty sparse forest. There's quite a bit of gold and stone, but not much else. There's this outside area that has more food resources, more wood resources. Um, and then between each of the players and in the middle is this lava terrain. Now, notice a distinction that there's this lava pool in the middle, and then there's these other areas which have little dark rocks on them. And what's going to be interesting here is that when units walk on this hardened lava, they're going to take damage over time. So strategically, it's going to be pretty interesting because players can cut across this lava in order to try to hit their opponents when they are vulnerable at the expense of taking some damage on their units. So we're going to be focusing on how to make this map, so let's get started. Now, I've talked about lava terrain in the past, and basically all it is a mod that changes the texture of moddable deep water into this lava texture. Now, one thing I may or may not have noted in the video is that all of the moddable textures in the game share this same texture file. So all these terrains share the same texture file, which in a lot of cases is a detriment, but since it's here, we can try to take advantage of that and utilize it on a terrain with different properties. So currently I have this map covered in terrain 99, which is deep water, and I can easily change that to something else. If I say I want moddable shallows, that could be 93 or 94, doesn't matter which one. But if I change it to 94, we can see, let's just see, this camel cannot be placed on the water because it's a water terrain, but this these ships can be placed on the water because it's water. So if I generate again, you can see the mini-map now looks like shallows. We can put ships on there, and we can put land units on there also. So it's in this way how we can utilize lava terrain for areas of the map that will have different properties in terms of what units can walk on them. So let's take a quick look back at the map layout. And if we're looking around here, we can see that players are pretty much going to be in a circle, which would indicate a random placement. There's going to be some zone separation between each of the players by this little lava terrain here, which is covered in rocks. So when we're making maps that have these kinds of tentacles, so to speak, it's not always super straightforward to get them to stop at a certain place, a certain percentage away from the edge of the map. So to achieve this is going to require a little bit of trickery with elevations. So we can notice that the player lands are at elevation 1, whereas the lava here is at elevation 0. So we will go into the test map over here, and we can keep this constant, but we'll call it lava shallow. And we can have lava, which is water, which is going to be 99. So for player setup, we can have this as random placement. And then for the base terrain, we're going to just leave it as some placeholder for now, because we're going to have to be replacing a lot of terrains in order to achieve the effect that we want. So we'll go create player lands. Base terrain will be DLC cracked. Land percent is going to be 100. Base size is going to be 9. Base elevation is going to be 1, and we'll say other zone avoidance distance. It's going to be 4, and we'll put a circle radius on it also. So fairly small circle. And then also borders. So it'll be 18% length away from the edge of the map, and that'll be the same for all the other borders as well. And then additionally, we have this land in the middle. It just helps keep everything nice and neat. And for this, we're actually going to use a land pattern like this. And that has to do with the fact that player lands tend to take precedence over neutral lands. So having a pattern such as this is going to help keep the middle area from being squished. And if we can keep that the same, actually, we'll make this a different terrain. We'll make this so that's going to create a circle of radius 5, and then to fill in that circle we will need one more land at position 50, 50. Remove this land %0, and it doesn't need a base size either, but it wouldn't make much of a difference anyway. And since we have a base elevation here, we must have elevation generation in our map somewhere. So go to the test map. Okay, so now, well, did I screw something up? Oh, this is supposed to be terrain. Terrain type. Okay, so now we have this basic layout where we have the player lands elevated, we have a neutral area in the middle, and we have this outside area which we need to fill with the different terrain. So what we're going to do next is we're going to elevate this outside terrain, which is dirt. So we're going to say create elevation. We'll have a lot of tiles. We'll put a spacing attribute of it 1. Spacing 2. So something we can notice when we do this is that it was able to elevate this outside terrain, which is outside of the player lands, but in between the player lands, there's not enough space in between to be able to produce any step of elevation, which leaves this area at elevation 0. And this is going to be pretty useful for us going forward. And in a similar fashion, we could do a similar thing with terrains. So if we go into the terrain generation section, we say create terrain DLC jungle grass. We have some spacing to other terrain types involved here. We can see that we're able to target the outside of the map here, and since there's not enough distance between the player lands to maintain that spacing to other terrain types of 3, we're not going to be creating any grass anywhere in the middle here. So that's also going to be pretty useful for us. Now the next step is going to seem a little counterproductive, but we're going to cover up this terrain with dirt, and then this terrain with dirt also. So we'll say dirt on DLC cracked. We will specify some clumps. And the same on lava shallow. So this is important because now that we have these two discrete zones separated, we can kind of control where the little tentacles are going to end, so to speak. And I'll demonstrate that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the terrain, which is DLC wet rock beach. We're going to generate it on dirt, and we will say spacing of the terrain types is 4. Now you can see this wouldn't work if there were different terrains in the middle here, but since all of the terrains in the middle are the same, we can get this nice area and fill everything in homogeneously. And now if we want to cover this remaining placeholder terrain back up with grass, we can do that. So we can say, and just remove this spacing of the terrain types. So now we fill that in with grass. We still have this over here, so we can say we're going to create DLC cracked. We're going to bring the cracked terrain back on DLC wet rock beach, and importantly we're going to specify height limits 1 and then all the way up. So now we brought our player lands back, but we still have this little lower terrain as DLC wet rock beach, and then what comes next is simply lava shallow on top of DLC wet rock beach, and it's going to be spacing to other terrain types of 1. Now, importantly, if we're intending to walk on this terrain here, I want it to be differentiable from the kind of lava you would not be able to walk on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to layer some rock terrain on top of this lava in order to give it a different texture. Now, if we go to the Terrains tab, there's going to be 2 rock terrains that can be used to layer on top of this. So beach wet rock is going to look like that, and then the non-saleable variant here is going to look a bit nicer like that, so we'll use that instead. So we need to declare that as a constant. That's going to be 81. So what we will do is we will say create dark rock on top of lava shallow, and we'll say terrain mask is going to be 1. 81. That doesn't seem right. That's because it's actually 82. Okay, so now we have all of the shallow lava is covered in this dark rock terrain masked on it, so it's easier to distinguish between lava that is walkable and lava that is not. So we can put some lava in here that is not walkable. So if I just wanted to put like some generic lava in on top of the lava shallow, and we can leave that spacing of the terrain types as 4. So this would differentiate the lava that can be walked on versus the lava that can't be walked on. But importantly, I do not want this portion to generate in King of the Hill, otherwise it'd be impossible to reach the monument because this is not intended to be dockable, even though it's technically shallows, but we'll address that issue later. So, if King of the Hill, else, and if. Now, at this point, I would like to point out some weird things that I see happening. Is that there's seems to be some elevation between the players that is not really intended. See, this little bump here is elevated where I prefer it not to be. And then this here is making it so this particular tentacle is not being able to connect to the middle. And if we take this particular seed and we comment out the terrain section, we can kind of see what's happening here. Is that the intention was there to be not enough space between these different lands to allow the dirt to be able to elevate, but it seems that between the middle, there's enough space to produce this elevation. So we can kind of combat this a little bit by reducing the amount of clumps we have for this elevation. So if I reduce the clumps down to 10, it's pretty likely that at least one of those clumps is going to be on the outside, which is where we would need it. And it's less likely that this really small section or this really small section would be targeted by one of those 10 clumps. So we can try that. We can see that those little bumps where we didn't want them to be went away, whereas the elevation on the outside is still going to generate pretty consistently. See, that's fine, and that seems to be fine also. So we can bring back the terrain generation section as we have it now, and then for the most part, the rest of the terrain generation section is just kind of decoration, so we can just copy that from the official map. So we'll grab that bit and put it in here. So that's nicely decorated. And then the majority of player objects are going to be pretty standard also. So we'll bring in an objects section. Alright, so we get the gist of what's happening here, and now comes the interesting part as to how do we make it so units will take damage as they walk across this lava here. And for that, we have to think back to a previous video where we talked about areas of effect. So essentially, we can use RMS effects to modify resources normally associated with the caravanserai in order to apply a negative regeneration to units that will pass over this. So in order to do that, we're going to need a couple constants. So these over here are the IDs of the relevant resources that are normally associated with the caravanserai. And then this last one is a invisible building, which we will use as the boosting building. We will see what that looks like. So at the very well, we have to do some pre-work before we do this. So what we're going to do first is we're going to say that effect amount set attribute of the building it normally has -2 hit points, which would make it go away as soon as the game starts, so we have to change it to have positive hit points in order for it to remain in the game. And then effect percent, we're going to modify ATTR radius 1 to be 50, and then the same with radius 2. So this is going to make it a 1x1 object. And then the last thing we're going to do to this building is we're going to say ATTR max range is going to be something bigger than 0, because when you try to display range indicators on an invisible building, when it's the boosting building, that has a tendency to crash the game. So this kind of combats that a little bit. So we'll go into the objects section, and we will say create object building. Number of objects is going to be very many. Set place for every player. I'm going to make and make them indestructible also. And then we also have to specify terrain to place on. Is going to be lava shallow, because it's only on the lava that we want these effects to be taking place, and we want these buildings to be generated. So this may be difficult to see right now. Let's go to options and turn on the range indicators. So since we gave that building a 1x1 area and some range, we can see that it's showing up on the grid here. So so we now know that these objects are successfully able to be placed. And then in order to change the effect that we're going to produce, we're going to say effect amount mod resource. So boosting ability 1, resource 259, is normally associated with a speed boost. We don't want to be affecting the unit's speed at all, so we want to remove this ability entirely. So we'll say ATTR set. We will set this to -1, so we basically remove that ability. Ability number 2, resource 260, is normally set to a regeneration rate, and technically we're going to keep that ability the same. We're just going to modify the value slightly. So normally the value is 60, and if we change it to -60, instead of units gaining 1 HP per second, they would lose 1 HP per second. So before we get too far, I want to test this. So where we have our scout, I want to change that into a trade cart. See, normally the caravans are supposed to affect trade carts, so in order to test it, I'm going to produce a trade cart. Actually, before setting either of those, it's actually quite important to set the ID of the boosting building to 1639 and the range also. So normally its range is, I think, 8. And we're going to set that to 0. So basically only when a unit is standing right on top of object 1639 will this effect take place. Okay, so we are in a standard game right now, and we are going to walk on top of this lava with our trade cart. And we can see that once we are on top of that terrain, we're going to be losing HP at approximately 1 HP per second. So that's good to know that that effect is working. Now, notice that I'm testing this in a 1 versus 1 situation. Now, I want to point something out, is what would happen if this was a team game situation. So now we have 8 players in the game, And now I'm going to walk this trade card on top of this lava, and we can see that we are losing HP at a considerably faster rate than 1 HP per second. And that's because this effect of degeneration will stack for every object owned by a teammate. And since we switched to an 8-player game, now that there are 4 players on each team, that degeneration rate is going to be 4 times faster. So that is something we would definitely want to avoid. We don't want the rate of degeneration to be dependent on how many players in the game. So we're going to have to figure out a way to fix this. And then we go back to the script, and then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the player lands. And now you're probably thinking at this point, why are we doing that? Aren't the player lands kind of important? And yes, they are. But removing this generic statement of create player lands is going to allow us to place each player land individually so we can have more flexibility on which units can generate for which players. So if I were to take a create land statement, and I will give it largely the same properties as these create player lands. So it will have the same terrain type, the same base size, same base elevation, and then the same borders. And in order to assign it to a player, I can use the attribute assign to. So assigning to @team100 is going to assign it to a random member of team 1. And if I did the same type of thing with team 2, so at this point we would have generated 1 land for a member of team 1 and 1 land for a member of team 2. And then for the other 6 players in the game, we will say @team -10. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And go into the test script. We notice that we have lost the zone avoidance. So we need to give all of these lands independent zone IDs. So at this point, not really much should be different compared to a generic create player land statement, but we can take this a step further by the lands which are assigned to the teams, team 1 and team 2. We will say land ID is 1. So at this point, what that does, as you can see now, the land was able to generate, but the player that it has happened to be assigned to doesn't get their objects placed anymore when the objects are being created with set place for every player. And that type of thing happens whenever you combine a player land with a land ID attribute. In order to get player objects to spawn for that particular player, we can take those similar kinds of objects. So we have the same objects, and instead of saying set place for every player, we will say place on specific. Place on specific land ID 1. So now we have one set of player objects that are specified to be set place for every player, and then another set of objects that are the same kind except placing on specific land ID 1. And we'll take the same seed, and we can notice that the random player on team 1 that happened to get placed and the random player on team 2 that happened to get placed now get their objects. And the benefit of doing it this way is that up at the top here, when we are creating these invisible buildings, instead of placing one for every player, we can say place on specific land ID 1, in which case we are making sure that we're only placing one set per team. So now if we go back into the game and we walk on top of this lava, we can see that the rate of degeneration is now predictably at 1 HP per second, which is where we want it to be. So it's the same rate regardless of how many players happen to be on this team. Now we can see by the lands that we've created up to this point that we've created 8 lands, and we are assuming that there's 2 teams in the game. So I want to make sure that the code that we write for our player lands is going to be more flexible than just handling 8 players and 2 teams. So if there happened to be a team 3 and a team 4 in the game, now we're creating 12 total lands. So is that going to change anything with what we have here in an 8-player setup? We can test the same seed, and it doesn't change anything at all. So basically, in the situation we have now, since there is no Team 3 and there is no Team 4, the land will not get placed. And that goes to having fewer than 8 players in the game. If I wanted to load a 2 versus 2 scenario, we have 12 total lands and now only 4 players, and only 4 player lands are able to be generated. It's first going to generate 1 land for team 1, 1 land for team 2, and then the other 2 players in the game will be handled in these random cases over here when we're assigning to at team -10. Now I want to go back and create another scenario right now. I want to go back to testing a 1 versus 1 setup. So we can see that 2 lands are able to be generated, but we can notice the lack of buildings that happen to be, placed on the lava here. And that's because the only places we are allowing those objects to be placed is on land ID 1. And in order to be placed on land ID 1, the player in question must be on a team. And if we're testing a 1 versus 1 setup, neither player has a teammate, so neither player land is going to be land ID 1, so no objects will get placed. But we can fix that fairly easily by saying assign to at team 0 and at team 0. So team 0 means you don't have a teammate. And we can see that these objects are able to be placed now. And I could keep adding lands if I want and never worry about a certain player being placed more than one time, because by default this flag value being 0 does not allow a player to be placed after they've already been placed. So in this way I want to handle as many scenarios as we could possibly run into. So in terms of assigning to team 0, the worst case scenario in terms of every individual player needing their own objects placed would be an 8-player free-for-all, in which case I would need 8 lands assigned to team 0. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8. So if we happen to have an 8-player free-for-all, then these are the 8 lands that would be used, and every individual player would be getting their own objects because they have this attribute of land ID 1. We already tested even teams, so let's test another odd case. Let's think about a 7 versus 1 scenario. So we would start at the top and look, and then assign to at team 1 would assign this land to a random member of the team of 7. These next 3, which are assigned to teams 2, 3, and 4, would not get placed at all because there's only one team in the game, and the one person who has no team would be taken care of by this land, which is assigned to team 0. So we've placed 2 players at this point, and then the remaining 6, which are on team number 1, would be taken care of by these 6 lands over here, and they would not get objects placed because they do not have land ID 1, and they don't need their objects placed because they have a teammate that got objects placed up here. I hope this is making sense. But to clear everything up, we'll make sure that each land has its own individual zone, so we could never run into a situation where lands could be touching each other. And then to top it off, we noticed that in our original player land statement, we had this circle radius attribute, and notice that we never added it to any of these lands over here. Fun fact, in order to apply a circle radius to the player lands, you don't necessarily need it to be assigned to a player land per se. You could assign it to a neutral land, say this one in the exact middle of the map, and it will still apply to the player lands. It'll be easier to see if the map is bigger. So we can see that circle radius is 25 if we want to bring it down to 20. We can see they got a lot closer to the middle, even though we're not assigning the circle radius attribute to a player land, we're assigning it to a neutral land. So that's just an interesting thing to be aware of. So with that out of the way, there's just a couple more things to take care of. So we'll change these trade cards back to being scouts. So currently on this map, these are technically shallows. So there's nothing preventing us from docking here. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the terrain ID of docks and harbors to be terrain ID 4. So terrain ID 4 is the terrain table of normal buildings, which can normally not be placed in shallows. So you can see we are no longer able to dock. And then one thing that is quite important, at this point in time, we are not changing the class of object that's going to be affected by the area of effect, which is produced by unit 1639. So we tested it by using the default class, which was trade card class. But for the end result, we would want it to affect more than one class. So just like in the previous video on areas of effect, in order to affect multiple classes, we're going to need an XS portion to this map. So basically, every frame, it's going to switch class to affect a different class and apply that degeneration, thus affecting multiple classes of units. So first thing we'll do is in the player setup, we will say we will include that excess, but it is important to know that since we are dividing this degeneration rate among 15 different classes, it means that the effective degeneration per class is going to be 15 times lower. So we need to increase the rate of degeneration in order to account for this. So if I say, instead of changing the value to -60, I'll say effect percent and say -40. And if we take a look at the UGC guide, which is going to help us with the calculation of what that resulting regeneration rate is going to be, it's going to be 3600 divided by the value that we specified. So go back to calculator. 3600 divided by 0.4. So this would be 9,000 HP per minute. But we have to consider that if we divide by 15, for the 15 total classes, we are at 600 HP per minute. So that would be the equivalent of 10 hit points per second. And to check if we are correct, we will save this. So we can try to take multiple units over here. So we can see the scout is getting hurt quite fast. And if we walk the villager over here to the other side, we can see that A, it's affecting multiple classes, and B, the rate of degeneration is quite high, approximately 10 hit points per second. We can take a look around at the map and see that it seems to be the same case for enemy units that are walking over this lava. They are similarly taking damage. So that seems to be working nicely. So just a few finishing touches here. The outside of the map now is pretty empty, so I'm filling it with some extra resources and some more decoration. So basically the inside of the map is going to be fairly barren in terms of resources, but the outside is going to have quite a bit more. So a couple things that I'm going to be paying attention to is whether the farm start is the best way to set up this map. I considered having animals in the start, but in that case we would have to consider what would happen if a deer or a boar happened to randomly walk on top of this lava. Would we have to consider adding a separate set of objects on this terrain for Gaia to affect Gaia objects? So I'm not really sure I want to worry about that right now, because another thing to worry about when we're dealing with these areas of effect is performance. When you're running into situations where you're placing a functional building for multiple players on every single tile of a terrain, that can sometimes get pretty taxing on the game. If the performance starts to suffer a bit too much, then a possible solution would be to increase the radius of the area of effect building and space the objects out a little more. But at least concept-wise, I think this map is in a pretty good shape. So I think that's going to be it for this video for now. So thanks to everybody for watching, and I hope you've learned something.